Okay, I'm just going to talk about some problems with conscience and the ability to use our consciences as a moral guide, because that's the kind of thing that they'll ask a question on in the exam. So, firstly, you need to find out the status of the conscience for each individual philosopher. So, within the Christian tradition, you have the idea that the conscience is the supreme authority. And even though it might not always be right, and that's important to remember with Aquinas, it might not always be right, and Augustine as well, you do have a moral duty to follow it. Well, then you've got someone like Freud. He basically says, oh my God, don't listen to the conscience. Ignore it, close it off, run away from your conscience, because actually it is simply internalised guilt. With Fromm, you've got the humanitarian conscience is the supreme authority, and you should always listen to that. But the authoritarian one, that holds less authority because, like Freud, it's just kind of internalised. Piaget and Kohlberg, they didn't say anything specifically about the conscience. They talked about moral development. And you can extend that and say, okay, if our conscience is just a sort of understanding of our cognitive and moral awareness, then actually the likelihood is that it shouldn't hold the supreme authority, because really it is just an individualistic understanding of morals and the kind of ethical guide. So it's important to think about what formation, or how the conscience was formed, the formation of the conscience there, in the idea that was it if it was divinely given, then you know that it's going to be the supreme authority. But if it's kind of developed and it's open to human error, then it might hold less authority. There are a few problems with the views of conscience. The first one being any view which states that conscience is the voice of God. Now, this is Newman's approach and Augustine's. So the issue here is that actually, if our consciences are the voice of God, why would we never agree on morals? Why is there moral relativism? And also, I mentioned it in another clip, is that actually, if our conscience is the voice of God, how could God's voice be quieter than the other voices? So when you think about a split conscience, and you're having a moral dilemma and you don't know whether to do one thing or the other thing, surely God's voice would be far superior, far louder, far less able to be ignored than a kind of wrong or twisted voice which is telling you to do something that's wrong. I think it's philosophically unsound to say that God could actually speak to people, in the sense that if he did, and you do get this with the accounts of near-death experiences and religious experiences, is that when God when it's been claimed that God's spoken to someone, the power of that is so great that these individuals who've undergone experiences like that often have life-changing results. So surely if the voice of God was our conscience, we wouldn't actually be able to ignore it, and we wouldn't be able to do something which is wrong. There's also an implication that we know God's commands in this, that we should be certain about what to do, like if conscience is the voice of God. And actually often is the case is that we don't, we get confused about which moral path to take, because we can't foresee which is the right one, and we don't understand which values should be placed above the others. Like, for example, with the idea of premarital sex, which is obviously a topic that we cover, it's like the love you can have for someone is so great and the passion is so intense that you desperately do want to have premarital sex with them. But actually then, equally, you might be worried about the idea of this being immoral and actually waiting until you are safely within the confines of a marriage. And a lot of people have issues with that, and have issues with commitment and beginning a sexual relationship after just starting a kind of loving relationship, and like, when does that begin? And that's a big thing. And so actually, if by implication we knew God's commands, surely then we wouldn't have such kind of deliberations with our conscience of like which one we should do. Then there's obviously the point that actually conscience might not be linked to God. I mean, atheists and humanists and agnostics, they all say they've got consciences, you know, they have a sense of moral duty, a sense of moral right and wrong, and that they are drawn towards one decision over another, and that actually they would argue that this is just a universal part of being human rather than being a gift bestowed on us by God. This is supported obviously by Freud, Piaget and Kohlberg, and you can use Fromm's humanitarian to support it as well, but obviously Fromm didn't say where the humanitarian conscience originated from, so you'd have to suggest that maybe it could originate from human interaction and be kind of like that. So it's not necessarily linked to God, but then you have to remember that the religious position is unfalsifiable, because if you said that, like if I said to a religious person, no, your conscience is, you know, it's a development, it's, you know, because we've interacted with humans, we have just an innate awareness, they would say, oh no, but God wants you to think that, God, because that's the epistemic distance, you know, God doesn't want you to know that it's from him, because otherwise we would have no choice. And the argument continues, because a religious position can always be defended, and frankly sometimes it just gets a bit laborious to keep going back and forward, and you just have to make up your mind like which one you think. The conscience implies the whole person is needed for like the involvement of thought, because you can have pangs of conscience, so when you're doing something that you might feel is wrong, you could have a kind of, oh my gosh, I shouldn't be doing this kind of moment. And so the idea is that actually, if the whole person is needed for conscience to be functioning, then like who has conscience and can you not have conscience? Can you ignore it? And other kind of little just issues with exactly what conscience is. I've written down that conscience appears to exist simultaneously as a separate entity, often standing over or against us. It's kind of, it almost, for the religious idea, it almost aids dualism in a way, because it is, especially if it's bestowed on us by a supreme power, there's an idea that actually conscience, although it's dependent on us, our bodily survival, it actually is, there's something very different, very distinct between it and like what other parts of us there are. It also implies personal responsibility. Jack Mahoney, Mahoney, says, when I say my conscience tells me, all I'm really saying is I think. This is quite an interesting view, and it would support a lot of the secular ideas like Freud and Fromm again, and Piaget and Kohlberg, is that actually we are simply taking our previous experiences and our internalised beliefs and saying, in my opinion, this is what I think you should do, or this is what I think I should do. Now, there's also another kind of debate whether conscience is innate or it's acquired. Freedom and knowledge are required by the conscience, because if we're not free, the conscience becomes irrelevant because it will be wholly determined. But obviously let's not go too far into that, because that's a topic for free will and determinism. But there is that issue that if you cannot be free, your conscience really doesn't play any sort of part in your life, because it's already done, if that makes sense. You know, your actions are already laid out for you. So often throughout many theorists, they've implied that there's an innate knowledge of the good, like with Aquinas, Butler, Newman, any of the more modern virtue, like religious virtue ideas of conscience, and obviously G. Moore's intuitionism. There's a kind of innate knowledge there. But actually, do people really have that? I mean, like, when you think about it, when did you start knowing the good in your life? I still sometimes think I don't know it like now, and in terms of the theories that we've looked at, I'm kind of into the last stages of developmental conscience, or kind of bestowed conscience. I'm nearing the end of developing my conscience, and I still don't have this innate sense of that's right. Yeah, that's right. I can't say that about a lot of things, and I think that people still have this deliberation of what is right and what is wrong, because when you get to certain moral things, you honestly don't know. To support this, you could argue about Freud and his challenge to the innate conscience, the idea that actually we just acquire these principles. And the reason sometimes that we don't know is because we don't have the knowledge base or the experience base to be able to say this is right, this is wrong. And then this might also be a problem for kind of from the humanitarian conscience. If you just don't know, then do we have this humanitarian conscience? Is there something which is right and wrong, and some kind of innate ability within us to know this? The weaknesses of an intuitive conscience. So this is Butler, Newman and Augustine. They all went for the intuition kind of approach. So if our consciences are able to detect or determine morality, so Newman said that we detect immorality, Butler said that we can determine it. Why are individuals able to make mistakes and do wrong actions?